So I'm Susannah.
I'm Nathan.
We're siblings. We're both post-Mormon. You stepped away from the church when?
Around 18 or 19, probably 19 is more accurate.
Yeah,
So that was 30 years ago.
right. That being said, Mormon history has definitely still informed your life, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was always the backdrop of everything, even after I no longer believed. It was still influential, definitely.
And I stepped away just a couple years ago in my 40s. I have a long history of being a believing Mormon,
Yeah.
devout, devoted. You and I have been talking about doing this project, doing this podcast for a while now. I have felt the need to find some way to be more vocal about what I've been through. I mean, I'll just speak for myself as a woman. I mean, I was, and I am going to use the word groomed. I was groomed from the earliest moments of my childhood toward dependency, toward submission.
Yeah.
And that's what's so hard because I love my Mormon people. And I carry the ache in my heart knowing that some of the things that I'll be saying will be hurtful. That's not my intention, but I feel very strongly that, well, when I talk about the harm, I want to be careful because there is so much good in Mormonism, so much about you and I, our shared Mormon heritage that I am so proud of. When we're talking about heritage, I am proud to be a Mormon woman. Mormon women have been the backbone of incredible accomplishments, building things out of nothing. But it's really important to talk about the harm. We don't. Nothing changes, nothing heals. Future generations are not saved from that perpetual harm. As children, we were not taught critical thinking skills. We were taught to believe.
Yeah, in fact, we were discouraged from thinking about things in detail. And to do so was often accused of being, rationalization or overthinking. I remember a moment, probably in my mid-teens, when I had been really thinking about the nature of God. I was very excited about these ideas, what God could be or what God's nature could be. And I brought them up in a priesthood meeting. It was the male teacher and the other young men in the room. I was curious what the young men's leader would think. I remember him looking at me with a very stern look on his face and him saying, "You think too much about this," and
Mm.
then moving on and talking about something else. And I remember sitting there thinking, how is it possible to think too much about God?
Right, right.
Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? Isn't that how we're supposed to be centering God in our lives? Really trying to understand God and God's will? I mean, that was so crushing to hear him say that. And yeah, I'm just feeling entirely deflated by that.
He might as well have said, "You're getting too close to the curtain. You're not supposed to look
Hmm.
behind the curtain." That is what he was communicating.
Absolutely.
Don't ask too many
Yeah.
questions. That which is good can withstand scrutiny. And that is what we were taught
Yeah.
not to do. Do not scrutinize. You are being prideful. You think that you know better than God and
Yeah.
his prophets and his church leaders. You need to just believe. That is the token trait of a good
Mhm.
person, is
Mhm.
just believing. I have often looked back and thought about what caused you to, and I would say have the courage, but I don't know if you were thinking in terms of courage as a teenager. I think you were trying to survive, right?
Yeah,
To step
absolutely.
away.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what caused you to step away and me to stay in the faith? There's some dynamics there in regard to you were a son, I was a
Mhm.
daughter. The misogyny and the patriarchy was so thick. We were
Mhm.
drinking it. We didn't know any different. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that as a teenager, you just felt so misunderstood and so hurt that that is what caused you
Mhm.
to make that break at that age.
Yes, that's a fairly good, odd summarization. Contrary to the common accusation of why people leave, anybody who has had a faith crisis, the faith crisis almost always happens when you are trying hardest to be faithful, right?
100%.
To stay in the faith.
Yep.
And that's very much what happened. I'm sure we'll talk at length and details about more of this. Some of it for me was a series of realizations. In fact, the comment that you just made, that was a sentence that came into my mind probably around age 17 or 18 that truth is what withstands examination. It's long before I even knew that science was a thing beyond just a class I had to take at school. The idea that true things exist in and of themselves, and they're true not because someone tells you they're true, but because no matter how hard you try to tear them down, they don't tear down. And I remember having that weird realization, probably around 17, that, yeah, truth is what withstands scrutiny. It dawned on me in that moment that it was really weird that church leaders were always telling us not to look at things, not to trust other sources.
In the,
Yeah, but
yep.
just to have faith. I started to feel suspicious of this. I remember probably 16 or 17, I was thinking at that time of some future point when I could own my own car. I had thought to myself, at some point in the near future, I'm going to have to go to a used car lot. And I don't want to get defrauded. And I remember having the thought, if I went to look at a car and I wanted a bunch of information about the car, and then the guy at the car lot said, well, don't look under the hood, I would instantly assume, he's hiding something from me, trying to defraud me. And yet, we're not supposed to take the same tactic in something as important as our eternal souls.
Right, right.
You
Exactly.
know, and then of course, in typical fashion, having that thought and then feeling guilty for having had that thought. But that left a lasting impression on my young mind that if something really is true, no one should ever be worried about examining it because it will withstand examination.
And it seems to me that you stepped away, not this courageous,
Mm,
certain statement of this
mm,
connection, embracing your own life. You tell me if this is inaccurate, but I wouldn't have seen it this way at the time. I'm
mm,
4 years younger than you. And so,
mm,
I'm 14, 15 as you
mm,
leaving home. I wouldn't have seen it this way at the time, but now as a 45-year-old mom who
mm,
has kids that are teenagers around
mm,
that same
mm,
age, I look back on 18-year-old you and
mm,
19-year-old you, and it seems to me that especially with a clearer understanding of what it was that we went through as children, because
mm.
we didn't come, well, and I don't, it may be more of a standard Mormon home than we think, which how awful and sad is that? We
Yeah.
grew up in an abusive home. We'll get more into that, but it seems to me looking back, especially with the understanding I have now and all the healing I've tried to do regarding what abuse is and how it
Mhm.
impacts children, I look back on 18, 19-year-old you, and it seems to me that you were almost like a deeply, deeply wounded animal crawling away
Mm,
from a dangerous place, hoping to
mm.
find something better down the road.
I would say that this is generally true. Before I ever had any serious consideration that the Mormon faith might not be reality, it might not be the truth of the universe, I definitely was a real believer. And I know plenty of people are skeptical from an extremely young age. They hear certain claims from family members and from church members, and they always approach it with a kind of detached scrutiny. I don't know if I envy those people or not. I was definitely a believer. I believed very strongly. I believed in the supernatural. I believed that, God and Jesus were up there looking down on us. And of course, we'll talk about some stories from our youth that seem to support the idea of supernatural powers. I fully believed. And then probably around age 16 or 17, I encountered a few friends who, we were becoming sophisticated enough so that we could actually start thinking about philosophical ideas. I had a couple of friends who questioned me about my faith and even kind of ridiculed, like, how can you believe this stuff? This stuff is silly. I remember being very angry and thinking, well, this is my faith. This is my religion. How dare you scrutinize it in this way? I knew that the Mormon truth was real. I knew that the Mormon church was true. I knew it strongly. And I even remember thinking to myself, I need to stop being friends with these people. I need to stop spending time around them. They're bad influences. And then, of course, at the same time, as so many people in that position do, I started thinking, I need to really understand why my religion is true. A more examined faith, right? Like, why do I believe what I believe? What real world reasons are there to believe it? As with so many young people, your brain reaches a certain level of sophistication and you start considering more broad existential questions. And so that was kind of a beginning that led toward me considering my faith with open eyes, trying to actually look at it and examine it and be aware of it. and be conscious of my mental state, be conscious of my faith, and not floating along as I had through all of my youth. Of course, this is true. Of course, God is up there. But taking the tactic of, no, I'm going to pay close attention. I'm going to notice.
Yeah.
I'm going to be aware of my faith. And so that was, honestly, that was the beginning of the end.
Right, right. And for me, looking back on those years, the example we had of what a man's role was versus a woman's role very strongly influenced how I perceived myself. Our dad was definitely in charge, and our
Hmm.
mom was
Yeah.
definitely supposed to be obedient to him. I think because of how unpredictable our dad's approval was, how
Hmm.
unpredictable his good moods were,
Yeah.
how unpredictable his demonstrations of love were. I look back at myself as a child and I really think I was just a little girl desperate for my daddy's
Hmm.
love. And so as I grew into my teenage years, I mean, I had questions. There were things I didn't like, there were things I didn't
Hmm.
want. There were definitely things there. I can think of times where I used those unnurtured critical thinking skills, right? Like it just,
Hmm.
they kind of poke through and I would have questions like, wait a second. And I'll just make a quick reference. I remember reading something in the Doctrine and Covenants, and it was Joseph Smith giving it was God giving a commandment through Joseph Smith to do, I don't know what, XYZ. I remember as a teenager thinking to myself, it just seems really convenient. What if it's not God? What if it's just Joseph Smith and he's just
Yeah.
saying what needs to be said for him to get his way in this situation?
Hmm.
Get what he
Yeah.
wants. And I'm telling you, the shame I felt after
Yeah.
I had that thought was
Yeah.
so almost debilitating because I was one of
Hmm.
those kids that just desperately, because in my mind, our father, the church, God, all the same. The authority, when it came to pleasing God or doing what God wanted or doing what the church wanted or doing what our dad wanted, all the same. For me, in my mind,
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
wasn't anything that my dad would have wanted of me that the church also didn't and God also didn't. Like
Yeah.
it's all the
Yeah.
same. My decisions were made largely out of pleasing my dad and getting his love and his approval.
Something that occurs to me in this moment as I compare what you just described with all of my childhood up to that point, I think this is a great illustration of the power of patriarchy because I cannot, maybe I had them and they were not significant enough in my mind to be retained in my memory. But through all of my youth, I never thought that church leaders could do things from a purely selfish perspective.
Hmm.
This must come from growing up with the idea that as a male human, certain things are simply destined
Yeah.
to me. It just didn't occur to me that these men could be either consciously malicious or delusional enough to think that, like, no, they might make a decision, claim that it is divinely inspired, but it's purely for their own benefit. It's fascinating to me that at a younger age, you were more open to that suspicion.
But I shut it down so fast.
Yeah, but you had it.
I did have it.
I never did. I
Interesting.
didn't start having such suspicions until I was well into my panic of what if the church isn't true.
Interesting. We're going to be referring back to a lot of our childhood experiences because that's what informs us. We're going to be talking a lot about generational trauma. First of all, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an expert. We've talked about this before that we want to make this clear. We are experts in nothing except for our own life
Own
experience.
experiences.
You professionally, not a psychologist. Me,
Hmm.
professionally, not a psychologist. We're also not historians, but we are seventh generation Mormon
Yeah.
on every side of our family except
Well,
for one. We're talking about, what is it, 32 different families when you go back far enough. And I'm just stopping at a certain generation. Not all of our lines of ancestry joined in the same generation back. Almost all of our third great grandparents were Mormon except for
mhm,
one. We're going to get into that. But, I'm
mhm,
just trying to give an understanding of how Mormon our DNA is. But we
mhm,
do have one set of six great grandparents born in the mid 1700s. They were very elderly by the time they joined the church. This particular line, I'm confident you don't know this detail. They are the Lee family, and yes, they are also the ancestors of Church President Harold B. Lee.
wow.
we do not have a close relation to Harold B. Lee. I mean, we're talking so many generations down. But when I see those key names in our ancestry, I can't help but to look up and see if there's a connection to, Mormon royalty. And there is a connection. This Lee family, he is a descendant of them, and so are we. So anyway, we will be touching on generational trauma. We're not experts, but that is a huge thing that I have been learning about over the last couple of years as I've been trying to heal. I first was exposed to the idea of generational trauma through a book that I read that I will highly recommend anybody who's interested. It's not at all Mormon related, not even Mormon adjacent. The family in question, they were Holocaust survivors, but the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. We're talking about generational trauma, and they really get into how the children of Holocaust survivors were often those that suffered emotionally the most. Oftentimes their parents didn't want to talk about of course not. They didn't want to talk about Auschwitz. They didn't want to talk about watching their neighbors be dragged out of their homes. They didn't want to talk about what they'd been through, the starvation and the beatings, the murder and all the things. Of course they didn't want to talk about it, but these children who grew up knowing only the whispers oftentimes had deep psychological issues. There's a doctor out of Mount Sinai in New York. Her name is Dr. Rachel Yehuda, and I have read quite a few of the papers she's written. This is her field. She's an expert in generational trauma, and she's done a lot of studies ever since the 80s, 90s, and it's been decades that she's been working on this. And her work is phenomenal. But the book that I read, it was a memoir by a guy named Adam Frankel called The Survivors. And he accesses this story through something that happened in his life that was really difficult and traumatic and not at all his fault, but it was realizing something about his parents, and it had a direct impact on him. And as he hit his emotional break, because this was so traumatic for him, he started digging. And as he started digging, he started learning about generational trauma, and he wrote a book about that experience. And it is profound. It is moving. It really touched me when I read it. And I have always loved Mormon history. Of course, I was only reading what the church was producing. I didn't know what I know now. I only knew the correlated church-approved version of Mormon history. I just thought that was true. But I've always loved Mormon history. I've always loved family history stories. And the funny thing is, I say I love family history research. I love genealogy. The truth is, I am a mediocre genealogist at best. But I'm a digger, I get something stuck in my brain and I don't let it go. And because of that, I have found some pretty significant things about certain family members, certain lines of our family. Some of them, as you know, have been life-altering. But oftentimes I learn by just reading what other people have posted on various genealogical sites. And, as I did family history research, we'll call it that, even though a lot of times I'm not in archives searching through dusty boxes. I'm not in the basement of old churches looking through old baptism books. That isn't the kind of research I do in another life. I think I would have loved to do that. That is not how my life has turned out. So I don't do that. I do benefit from what other people do, and then they put it online, and I learn things from right here at home, from my computer, my office. So as we talk about various stories, I want to be very transparent that my sources are what's available to me. I am always happy to be corrected because a lot of these people have thousands and thousands of other descendants out there, and if somebody hears something that I say and they have more information, please correct me. I'm not an expert in any of this, but it's interesting to me looking back on my life in Mormonism. I loved family history research, but I wasn't doing with that information what a lot of Mormons were doing, and that is they would take those names and do ordinances in our temples. And I apologize to those who have no frame of reference for Mormonism. If you are daring enough to listen to this, we can do our best to explain things, but I can also refer you to other sources if you really want a comprehensive understanding of Mormonism. Don't want to talk about people's heads, but at the same time, that's not the purpose of this, to educate people about everything about Mormonism. But quick explanation, if you've ever seen a Mormon temple out there, Mormons believe that there are certain ordinances, like baptism is an ordinance, for example, certain ordinances that need to be done for people in order for them to be able to return to live with God again. A gateway, if you will, several gateways to get there. And Mormons believe that those who have gone before who did not have access to those ordinances need to have them. So they build temples where people go, and it's called proxy work for the dead. If you talk to a believing Mormon, that work is done out of a sincere hope to be with those people again. Sorrow about my grandfather died. For most everyday Mormons, all of that is just out of love for their family. I don't believe in any of that anymore, but I'm not going to criticize people for that. But that is what that is for. So,
Mm-hmm.
as a believing Mormon, in theory, that is why I should have been doing family history
Mm-hmm.
research. But I never once took a single family name to the temple, not on purpose, not to be like, yeah, that's not important to me. But
I'm curious, when you were doing all of this research and encountering new names, names of ancestors and other people who, by Mormon accounts, you should have been taking to the temple, did it ever occur to you, like really consciously, that you weren't? And did you ever feel guilty for not doing it?
oh, I did feel guilty because the truth is that, I mean, we have such a Mormon family that a lot of that temple work has already been
Mhm.
done.
Okay. So you
But
could just
I
do it.
wasn't sure if it had been done, but I also wasn't checking. And I did feel guilty about that. But it wasn't enough to get me to do it, because really the new information I would stumble
Mhm.
upon somebody that I didn't know about before. But mostly what I was finding were stories about these people that nobody had ever told me, that nobody was talking.
Right.
I think I'm confident in a lot of cases had been purposely buried, especially now that I have deconstructed my faith in Mormonism. I think all along, deep down, I felt desperate for answers. Why is my family like this? Why is my dad the way that he is?
Mhm.
Why do I carry this sense of I just never feel good enough. I always feel like I'm failing. What happened that caused our parents to be who they are? And I'd go back and figure out and learn about, say, our grandparents. And then I would be like, yeah, but why were their parents the way that
Mhm.
they were? And then
Mhm.
I'd go back another generation. And that is what has been a constant obsession for me for years and years and years. And it's been very interesting to me after deconstructing the faith to look back on all of that just obsessive researching I would do. I was a typical Mormon stay-at-home mom. I couldn't let it go. It just
Yeah.
was always a thing. And now that I'm where I'm at and I have read as much as I have about epigenetics and
Mm.
generational trauma and the reality of the fact that our DNA, and this is true all through history, human DNA, it is always mutating from one
Mhm.
generation to the next. Usually it's very subtle. That's the thing, it's always happened. Trauma changes us on a molecular level. And when we have children, they inherit that mutated DNA. I had this comparison and I want to be careful because I don't want to imply. So let me say this first. And especially for those that don't really have much knowledge about Mormonism or the history of Mormonism. Mormons, especially, there are those who joined the church more recently. They are just as Mormon as they have embraced the faith. And I'm not implying that they are not. The church does that. They spread
Yeah.
their gospel and people who have kept joining the church for many generations. We do descend from the earliest in Mormonism. And when we're talking about the historic Mormon people in the 19th century and early parts of the 20th century that really were just those that descended from those initial Mormon pioneers that went to
Mhm.
Utah. And there's a huge Mormon diaspora, and we can get into that. But right now I'm talking about the Brighamite sect, which I know even that is offensive to believing
Yeah.
in. Like, what are you talking
Yeah.
about? We are the only Church of Jesus Christ of
Yeah.
Latter-day Saints. And
Yeah.
I will also address the Mormon term and how the main body Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints doesn't want to be called Mormon anymore. I am not using that word to be offensive. I grew up being called a Mormon. So when
Mhm.
I'm talking about my Mormon history, I'm
Mhm.
talking about myself. I am not trying to be offensive to anybody that's still believing. But when we're talking about those Mormon pioneers, they were a traumatized people. And there's a huge persecution complex, and that is not the angle from which I am making that statement. I'm not claiming that persecution complex because, yes, they were traumatized by what happened to them, which in large measure was a consequence of what their leaders were doing that they, in some cases, did not know about. I will never say that violence is the answer, but in some ways, the way that the early Mormon people were being treated was a direct result of the bad actions of those Mormon leaders. And all too often, it was just the run-of-the-mill, good-hearted people who were looking for answers, who were looking for community that had joined Mormonism in those early days. They were the ones that got the brunt of that violence. And it was all too easy for their leaders to talk about how they were being persecuted for
Yeah.
their faith and
Yeah.
not take accountability for the ways in which their choices, Joseph Smith's choices, had actually led to that violence. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying they didn't take accountability. So that's kind of where that persecution complex comes
Hmm.
from. So the
Hmm.
Mormon people definitely experienced trauma from that. But I have been listening, and I will always promote the Sunstone Mormon History podcast. It's excellent. Anybody that wants to know about Mormon history, please listen to it because it is so good. Pretty much from when they were talking about Jedediah Grant, and then, I mean, it's probably 4 or 5, 6 episodes at this point that has been focused on the Mormon Reformation in Utah in the 80s. And the Mormon people who had been through the trauma of Kirtland and Missouri and Nauvoo and driven, across the plains. They were in some cases driven, the suffering of winter quarters, going across the plains, settling in Utah. We're in the 1850s and the Mormon Reformation happens. And basically it was church leaders feeling threatened at the lack of devotion from the members. I won't try to do it justice. Please go listen to Sunstone's podcast. Brian and Lindsay do an amazing job of explaining it, but they basically terrorized the people in Utah
Hmm.
in the name of the doctrine that they were,
Yeah, they meaning the church
the
leaders.
church leaders. I mean, that's where home teaching came from. And that for
Hmm.
me was so like such an assault to my soul when I realized
Yeah.
we grew up having these nice people come into our home and, express concern for us. How are you guys doing? We'll share a message. Let us know if you need anything. But how home teachers started was they were sending they were church leaders, but second or third tier. They weren't
Hmm.
the top in every Mormon community, all throughout what we now call the Book of Mormon Belt settlements, all the way down into southern
Hmm.
Utah, all the way up into northern Utah. Eventually, it was down into Arizona, up into Idaho, and eventually, it was down into Mexico, and then up into Canada. I mean, it was just the Wasatch Front, but it was just all the way up into Canada, all the way down into Mexico. They were sending home teachers to various places, and they were grilling the people. Are you doing this? Are you doing that? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? And it was like a secret police almost.
Yeah.
It was like a
The Stasi. It was
yes,
the NKVD. It was,
yes.
yeah.
And people
Yeah.
were terrified,
Yeah.
terrified because violent consequences were not out of the question. So as I've been learning about this history, I've just been like, for one, completely reshape my view of certain things like home teaching in
Hmm.
Mormonism, which today is, your home teachers will come over and help you mow your lawn if you broke your leg. I mean, they're just
Yeah.
nice people that want to help you out, but that is not how that started. And it is shocking. So when I talk about a traumatized people, there's a lot of layers to that. I do think women in particular are traumatized within Mormonism. Back then, polygamy was the practice of the Mormon people in Utah,
Hmm.
Bergamite
Hmm.
sect. We descend from many, many, many polygamous families, and there were underage brides. We're going to get into some of this. There's a lot there. And so the other day I had this thought. Again, I do want to be careful because as traumatized as the early Mormon people were, which are our ancestors, and we have inherited that trauma, as traumatized as they were, I do not want to imply that I think at all that it compares to what the Jewish people went through in
Hmm.
the Holocaust. Please, anybody listening, do not misunderstand me. That is not what I am implying. But I had the thought the other day because, of course, we know out in the world there are Holocaust deniers that want to claim that it didn't happen. It was all made up, which is awful, absolutely awful. But the thought occurred to me, what if the prevalent narrative in the entire world was a Holocaust denying narrative? And the children and then the grandchildren, great grandchildren of Holocaust victims and Holocaust survivors today, that experience was denied to them.
Hmm.
They had heard little whispers in their families, but don't say that out loud kind of a thing. And they were told that those were just made up stories, rumors, that it never actually happened. And yet they carried that DNA
Hmm.
inside of them
Hmm.
and they live their lives wondering, why do I feel this way? Why do I have these problems? What an absolute emotionally violent assault on the well-being of those people. The worldwide narrative was that happened.
accompanied by all of the bewilderment and guilt,
Fusion.
not being able to find solutions to these feelings. Yeah.
And it occurred to me if you apply that idea, and again, I'm not making a comparison of severity, but if you apply that idea to Mormonism, I feel like that is what has happened to the Mormon
Mm.
people. I bought all of these books. It's the Saint series. These books are the most recent attempt by the Correlation Department of the Church to produce a collective history of the church. They are more open than they have ever been in these books, but so much is left out that I don't think they can claim honesty. Let's just use you and I as examples. We are not famous. We are not important. We are just run-of-the-mill human beings born into a run-of-the-mill Mormon family. There is trauma running through our DNA that if the church had had its way, we would never know the source of because they whitewash their history. They do not tell the
Yeah.
whole history, and they tell their members if you are hearing something that is negative, that is anti-Mormon. On Brody is a historian that wrote really the first critical, and when I say critical, I'm not using it like the church uses it, like, oh, they're just trying to tear everybody down. I'm talking about critical thinking. I'm talking about peer-reviewed history, the first critical production of a history about Joseph Smith. She
Hmm.
talked about the treasure digging. She talked about all these things, polygamy and how it started. She really delved in. The prophet of the Mormon church, the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was her uncle. Uncle David, David O. McKay, grew up going to the family parties. It's just Uncle David. Oh, he's prophet now. You know, she was part of that Mormon royalty, but she dared to ask the questions. And they felt some betrayal because she was the niece of the prophet. They didn't suspect anything nefarious as she was requesting records, and they would sure, you can come look at this. But then she ended up producing this book that was, from what I understand, again, I'm not a historian. There are some things she got wrong, but we're talking about someone who was writing in the 1940s. I have access to some of the things we have access now, but from what I understand, by and large, it is very accurate. And a lot of the things that she put in that book, the church is now admitting to because
Yeah.
due to the internet, they cannot deny it anymore. She was blacklisted. She was excommunicated. I never even heard the name
Mm-mm.
Fawn Brody until I stepped out of the church.
Yeah, of course not.
The point I'm trying to get to is you and I are examples, but we as Mormon descendants carry trauma within us that by and large, the source of that trauma has been denied to us. The information has been
Yeah.
denied. And when you have to be loyal to the institution first,
Mhm. Yeah.
it causes you to justify
Yeah. Yeah.
dishonesty. You're not willing to call it dishonesty.
Yeah. Even the word apologist was never a word I knew when I was still a Mormon. Faithful believers would insist that people fall away because they listen to the Mormon haters. They listen to the false histories or the false narratives that ex-Mormons insist on propagating in every conversation. But what the past generation or two of Mormons and now post-Mormons really has exhibited is how many Mormons fall away without ever encountering any of that. This is very much how I did. I never knew about any of this historical stuff. Like you said, I never heard of Fawn Brody. None of this history played any part in how I fell away. It was a very difficult to face realization that the fundamental claims, I'm not even talking about theological claims, but just the fundamental claims of how the Mormon church makes people or makes people better people, which we were certainly told growing up, and how those claims of the method, how the Mormon faith does this, very often simply doesn't work. It simply doesn't happen. And that ended up being, for me, much more of an influential factor. I didn't listen when people told me. It happened very rarely. This was the early to mid 90s. Nobody knew anything about Mormons at this point. So very few people actually gave me criticisms of the Mormon faith or the Mormon church. But I know what my response would have been. My response would have been, oh, well, you're just a detractor.
A bigot.
None of what you're saying is true or even
Yeah.
can be true. No, for me, it was being pulled downward by the gravity of it, wanting to stay at the top of the mountain. and realizing that none of this works internally. I remember as a teenager getting off of work, working at a bag boy at a grocery store, stopping at a Wendy's on the way home to pick up dinner. And of course, in typical fast food fashion, what I got was just the soggiest, most disappointing food. It was a flat, limp burger and fries that I could just feel the heart attack developing. It was just awful. And I get home, the moment I walk in the door, a Wendy's commercial comes on. And the very thing I had just ordered and eaten was on the screen. And it was this glorious mountain of a burger. In my teenage, just learning what
The world was
the
like.
world was like. In that moment, I remember being furious,
The injustice of it
the
all.
injustice of it. And here I am at 16, maybe 17, earning money for the first time, really appreciating how difficult it is to earn money, how difficult it is to save money, just the cost of things, and just being furious. Like,
They lied to me.
they lied to me. I've thought about it at different times in the past. Those little moments of realizing that things that seem totally normal, things that might even seem good intended, can still entail a very cynical and even sinister motive. And certainly within a year or two later, when I was in full panic, terrified that everything I had believed up to that point was not true, I looked around me and I saw something quite contrary to what we were told, which is that if you are righteous, if you keep the faith, if you are worthy, you and your family will be happy, that you will find true happiness. And in fact, not only will you find happiness, but people outside the faith can never attain such happiness
Right.
as you will find,
Yep.
right? And that was a very important element of the faith, was that real, pure, genuine emotion is only possible within the Mormon Church, and that all relationships outside of the Mormon Church are not real relationships. Married couples who are not Mormon, they don't love each other the way that Mormons do. Families who are not Mormon don't really love each other the way that Mormons do. And with that highly idealized notion of the state of existence the Mormon faith promises, kind of like that Wendy's commercial, I just started noticing more and more that there wasn't happiness around us. There wasn't fulfillment around us. And my panic increased when I could actually start to have conversations with people. I mean, these were other kids hurting like me, and they would tell their honest experiences in a very kind of sheepish and nervous way, talking about these things for the first time, knowing that they shouldn't be talking about it, whether it's a religious
Yeah.
pressure or not. And just realizing, just learning that not only were things not good in our home, but among other families of the church, even the families of church leaders, they were going through very, very similar things. And that wrenched up my panic.
Yeah. Like, can't be true.
Yeah, this is not what I was promised. This is not what I was told. As I'm thinking this, of course, in my mind are all of the warnings. If you start having these thoughts, it's the devil, it's the power of Satan, that it's your own unworthiness. And every time that I had that guilty feeling, like if I were worthy, I wouldn't be thinking this way, I would then remember that we were at church every Sunday, every Sunday.
Every Sunday.
We were at young men's and young women's meetings
Every week.
every week. We were involved in everything. We didn't miss anything. We didn't miss family home evenings. We didn't miss,
For study.
seminary was taught by our own mom at our
Yep.
own house.
No caffeine. No
Yep,
swearing.
yep.
Yep.
We weren't allowed to say but growing up,
Yep.
right? Like the phrase, he kicked his butt. That was forbidden.
Yep.
We were not allowed to say that word. We never swore. We were as righteous of Mormons as it's possible to be. And yet I'm looking around and I have no reason to suspect that other Mormon families aren't equally righteous. And yet I looked around and realized I'm just surrounded by unhappy people. They come to church, and I don't know, maybe this is just related to being a sensitive kid. I could just see how people were barely hanging on in a lot of instances. Comparing those things, how devout and how obedient and how righteous our family was, compared with how unhappy we all were.
Hmm.
And at times terrified, not just unhappy, not just a general malaise of unhappiness, but terrified at times.
Most days of our childhood, we were scared.
Yeah, we dreaded when our father would come home from work. We dreaded it. And, not only was he a priesthood holder, he was typically in the
Leadership.
bishopric.
Yep.
And just that juxtaposition, how obedient we were and how unhappy we were, that comparison just dragged me closer and closer to the edge. And I didn't want to go.
Wanted it to be true. You were told it was.
No, and I remember thinking, like all typical Mormons, well, I just need to do more. And then looking around and realizing there's nothing more I can do. I'm doing everything that I can. And so then, of course, I thought, well, I need to pray more. I just pray, pray, pray. I need to pray more. And I remember praying and praying and praying and praying. And now, of course, in my very adult perspective, I understand that there are humans with different collections of personality characteristics which make them more open to spiritual experiences. I think now maybe I'm the kind of person who I'm less susceptible to experiences that I would call spiritual. Nowadays, I would call them something else. But at the time, I had no notions of that. And of course, I had been told that if you pray, God will answer you. I mean, what's the phrase that we always heard and grew to hate? Broken heart and a contrite spirit. If you pray with a broken heart and a contrite spirit, God will answer you. And I remember praying and praying and praying and praying. And I even remember saying the prayer, God, if you just let me know that you're there looking down, I can survive this. And one day I prayed that, and I realized that the silence is the answer, and that silence was all the information I needed. If I were to put my finger on one moment when I lost my faith, it was that moment when I asked for comfort and the response was silence.
Right. I'm so glad that you shared that. So I think I'm gonna switch gears. What we thought to do was just kind of present, what it is that we're trying
Mm.
to do. And I have a couple more things just to wrap up that. There are some stories that I will likely share at some point to kind of explain what I'm about to say. But I have at times over the past several years said some public things about my experiences and or tried to stand up for myself a little bit. And from many corners of my, I'm going to say former Mormon community, which includes, current and past ward members, which includes friends, which includes family members, I have from various corners been called hateful. And I'm not going to lie, that has been really painful for me. And I really taken that into consideration as I have thought about doing this project. But when I look at the history of the ways in which women in particular have been silenced,
Yeah, yeah.
I am able to recognize that that word placed upon me from people whose love I thought was unconditional.
Yeah, you thought their love was unconditional because they said it was. It wasn't a delusion you constructed on your own. They insisted that their love was God's love.
And I have learned the hard way that their love was dependent upon me towing the line. And they only cared about, pain that I experienced. They only cared about pain that didn't threaten their sense of
Mhm.
rightness. That
Yeah.
if there was any pain that I had that rocked the boat of their certainty
Mhm.
in a certain belief system, that I was at fault. I wasn't using the atonement to overcome. And speaking out was me being influenced by Satan,
Yeah.
that there must be some great sin I was committing that would make me susceptible to being influenced by Satan, that standing up for myself, which is what I call it, but they would call, in the Book of Mormon, they call it murmuring. They would call complaining. They would call being faithless. I was so conditioned toward obedience from childhood. And I can now call it grooming. That word is going to be very offensive to people,
Mhm.
along with indoctrination. That is sincerely how I view it at this point. I was so conditioned toward submissiveness and obedience, and that's what good women did, that into my 30s, I didn't know how to set boundaries. I didn't know how to stand up for myself in any
Mhm.
way, shape, or
Yeah.
form.
Yeah.
I thought that was prideful. I believed that good women were submissive and obedient,
Hmm.
and any unhappiness I was experiencing was my fault. I will share this more personal detail. I cannot tell you how many times I got down on my knees and I said, Heavenly Father, please help me to figure out how to be a better wife.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's so unhappy with me all the time. I don't know what else to do. And I don't want to say any more about that at this point. I will just give a quick recap of how my brain was rewired. And that happened because my third child was born severely disabled. She has CHARGE syndrome. She has Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. She requires full care, bathing, feeding, dressing, all personal hygiene. She's deaf-blind, does not walk well. There's a lot of safety concerns. And of course, when she's a baby and we're first getting the pieces of information, little by little, as we took her to different specialists, there's no way of knowing what that child's life will end up looking like, what my life will end up looking like.
Mm.
And over time, I found myself in a place where, especially as she started school, I had been taught to listen to authority my whole life. And so that's what I did. I listened to teachers, I listened to therapists, and I did what they said. But I started having some experiences where I didn't agree with them. And I didn't feel like they were doing what was right for her. And I suppressed those thoughts at first because I had been taught to listen to authority. They were the ones with the occupational therapy credentials or the,
Mm.
masters of education or whatever. And I was just a little Mormon stay-at-home mom. But over time, when I would look at my daughter and I could see how uncomfortable she was and I could see how unhappy she was, I couldn't bear it. I
Mm.
couldn't bear it. So I started researching. I started inserting my opinions. I started standing up for her. And it was, she's 13 now. I would say it was I'll just say a 10-year process. That's not exact, but little by little, I gained more and more confidence standing up for her. I was also able to see that because I believed, due to how I was raised, that my worth was dependent upon what I did, what I offered the world. And here was this little girl whose smile would completely light up a room, but outside of that, would never offer the world anything. She was never gonna be a scientist. She was never gonna ride a bike. She was never gonna play the piano. She was never gonna be a gymnast. She wasn't even gonna learn how to add. And yet she was so amazing. And by mothering her and caring for her and knowing that her value and her worth was inherent and had no dependency upon what she did for anybody else. Little by little, I started applying that to myself. Maybe I don't have to please other people in order to have value. Maybe when other people aren't happy with me, there's not a reflection on my worth. And the more bold I became in advocating for her, over time, it taught me how to advocate for myself. And as I did that, the immediate result was it caused problems in my marriage. Advocating for my daughter taught me how to advocate for myself. And that is ultimately what led to me getting to the point where I realized that in order to stay in my marriage, I would have to go back to being the person that I'd been
Yeah.
before, but it was too late. I was already different. My brain had already been
Yeah.
rewired. I
Yeah.
was daring to believe that I mattered just because I existed,
Mhm.
not because of other people's approval.
Yeah.
That is what led me to where I'm at. And you said once, and it stayed with me ever since, because when I filed for divorce, I did not have a safety net. I did not have a career. I did not have any
Mm.
money of my own. What you said to me was that I jumped off a cliff and figured out how to build a parachute on the way down. I think about that often because I think it's absolutely true. But I think to add to that analogy, the prairie behind me was on fire. For me, staying on top of that cliff wasn't an option anymore.
Mm.
I just hope that I would survive the fall and be able to pick up the pieces. I couldn't not jump. And I thought of that analogy the other day when I texted you and I was like, let's just start.
Mm.
Because I do carry a lot of fear
Mhm.
about doing this project. I don't like being called hateful. I hate the thought that people are going to say Susannah's doing an anti-Mormon
Mhm.
podcast. I don't like that. That's not my intent. I
Mhm.
love the Mormon people. But the other day I realized, I think I need to just jump
Mm.
because, Maya Angelou's that quote, she said, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." I have a lot of healing to do, and I have talked to you a ton about what I've been through and the healing process. I've been to therapy. I've done all the things. I need to do this more openly.
Yeah.
I need to talk more openly. I do have a hope that maybe we can build somewhat of a community of
Mm.
people who want to have these conversations about the generational trauma, about how to heal, about the dishonesty, about the ways in which families are torn apart. For a church that says they are all about families, boy, do they tear families apart. You and I, again, I don't want to go into it too much right now. We don't have time, but there's some very significant estrangement in our family. And people that I deep down are amongst those that I love the most are the very people who have most, I guess, firmly called me hateful and told others that I'm hateful. There's just not a way to describe adequately the pain of that, because that's never been my intention. And all the choices that I have made over the last couple of years has been to stop the harm I was experiencing in a patriarchal system, the result of which offers a smaller group of people, mostly men, power at the expense of other people's power. But that to them is like you're being hateful by saying
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And I know that I'm not motivated by hate. It doesn't change the fact that being identified that way hurts deeply. So that in and of itself has prevented me, well, not prevent, but like postpone,
Sure. It's made you
pause,
hesitant.
exactly,
No,
to
yeah.
do this. But the other day, I don't know, I really hit a brick wall in regard to, I keep saying my mental health, but I don't even know if that's an accurate way to say it. I just need to jump off that cliff and
Hmm.
start having these conversations. I know, and it's going to make me emotional. I know there are so many Mormon women out there who are
Hmm.
suffering.
Yeah.
They are
Yeah.
suffering. They are being mistreated, abused, and they can't get out. Don't have money. And I did not have a career. Thankfully, I was able to build a business. I am a special education advocate. Those advocacy skills I learned with my daughter in special education, which I have successfully been able to turn that into some income.
Hmm.
And it is very meaningful work, and I absolutely love it. But I very much know how it feels to be a Mormon woman who followed the path, who did
Hmm.
all the things, who
Yeah.
followed rules, who, yes, I graduated from college, but I made no effort to build myself a career when I was
Mm.
young because good, righteous Mormon women get married and have children. I followed the plan and found myself in a place where I could not stay inside my marriage. I literally had no idea what I was going to do. And I was not altogether certain that homelessness and pennilessness wasn't about to happen. It was a very scary time. I know I did the right thing. I think my kids and I are doing better than we ever have been since that
Mm.
moment.
Better than you were told you would be doing.
Percent. I have been very fortunate. I don't have anything extra, but I am getting by.
Hmm.
And that compared to how I felt when I was making that decision feels like wealth. I am okay, but I know how it feels. Find yourself in that position and have nothing to fall back
Yeah.
on. I know I'm not the only one who has been through this. I know I'm not the only one who has and is currently suffering. I do hear I'm a huge fan of all the podcasts and anybody that's post-Mormon, you know what they are. There have been some mentions of generational trauma, which my ears perk up and I just listen, listen, listen. And other sources like that book, The Survivors, and Rachel Yehuda's work to learn about generational trauma. And I do particularly appreciate when, especially in these post-Mormon podcasts, where they apply it to Mormonism. But I have not found a space where that is the focus of what
Mhm.
is talked about. And I am not done healing. I'm not done growing, overcoming. I carry a lot of pain. And, they say if you can't find what you are looking for, create it. I need a space where healing from generational trauma of the Mormon variety is the point. We said this before. I'm not an expert. You're not an expert. We're
Yeah.
not psychologists. We're not historians. We're just people. But my hope is that in this project, in this podcast, we can simply start conversations. that maybe other people can carry
Mhm.
over to their own lives. But that is the purpose of what we're
Yeah.
trying to do.
Yeah.
And I have found a lot of healing, also a lot of pain, researching family history stories. And I look forward to sharing them with you because you don't really know very much at all. I know an awful lot.
Yeah, very little. Mormon history and our family's Mormon history has zero to do with why I stopped believing. So I exited without ever learning any of this. And so that's going to be, there's never the right word. Eye-opening, elucidating, shocking, gut-wrenching. I'm sure there's a long list of feelings that I will feel while you're telling me about our ancestors.
You have no idea.
Yeah, yeah.
And, we're going to finish up and then we can jump in and start recording. This is a story that the more I learn, the more my heart breaks. I have been antsy to share this
Mm,
with you. I will give a little bit of a teaser in my effort to research this particular family. I found information about something that through my post-Mormon lens meant something very different than it would have if
mhm.
I had seen it prior to seeing the
Yeah.
religion. And I was just shocked and horrified, and I didn't quite know how to find out more information. And because I'm such a fan of the Sunstone Mormon History podcast, I sent Brian Buchanan an email at Benchmark Books, and I said, hey, you don't know me, but, and I just told him enough about it. And I said, could you give me some guidance? Where do you think I could look further? And it ended up that he was so intrigued by this story that I sent him. It wasn't just what a distant family member had written down. They had the newspaper article to back it up. So it wasn't just a story. I could send that to Brian Buchanan and with my question. So I think he knew right away that it was legit. He is so intrigued, and I guess he shared it with Lindsay Hansen Park. They're so intrigued by it that they're going to do research, and he told me that they are going to talk about it on their
Okay.
podcast. I don't know when that will happen. I'll just be an eager listener like everybody
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I'm not involved with that at all, but I'm looking forward to hearing whatever it is that they have to say. But I figured because this story has been so heavy on my heart that I would start with this particular story with you.
Mhm.
And that way, you know what I know. And so whenever they produce that podcast, you'll have the background and can
Mhm.
listen to it without my
Mhm.
story
Yeah.
being spoiled, right? Because part of the fun of what I am looking forward to in what we're doing is your reactions to what
Mhm.
I'm going to
Mhm.
share.
My students will tell you if you want to distract me from the lesson plan for the day, they just have to ask me a history question. The history buff in me is absolutely excited to learn about this. The part of me that yearns for emotional stability is expecting to lose a bit of that stability as I'm hearing these stories because I've made an effort over time just for my own sanity to not spend a lot of time thinking about the crimes of the Mormon religion just so that I can be not hateful about the world. And so hearing some of these stories, I'm sure are going to ignite some little flames of fury that I will process with you through further discussion.
Part of this story left me numb for probably 2 days.
Wow.
And I was telling my oldest daughter, who's 18, because I told her about what I had discovered. And I
Mhm.
told her, I said, I have felt like I'm floating for a couple of
Yeah.
days now. I think I am experiencing trauma. She was like, yeah, I'm sure you are because of what I learned. So we will tell potential listeners, thank you
Mhm.
for listening to this episode of My Mormon History. That name being chosen because this is what they say Mormon
Mhm.
history is. But even though I don't believe, and even though I have very much been ostracized and even shunned from my former Mormon community, I am a seventh generation Mormon. Nobody gets to take that identity away from
Sure.
me.
Mhm.
This is my history. This is my family. This is my Mormon history. And I get to own it
Yeah. No, you get to tell it.
because it literally runs through
Mhm.
my veins, part of me.
History is whatever can be demonstrated to have actually happened. That's the service that historians really do to human society, is actually giving the evidence, actually showing what is real, and not letting anyone tell them that they shouldn't tell this history.
And if
So,
talking about this history and sharing my heart, I am identified in some circles as hateful, then so be
mm,
it. It will make those who don't want this to be reality uncomfortable, but I will only be speaking the truth. I will only
mhm,
be speaking my honest experiences without a desire to harm other people, but
Mhm.
truth matters. It's really important to me. So I am hoping those who have listened thus far might join us in future episodes as we
Mhm.
produce them and will become part of the conversation. I have set up an email address. It's simply mymormonhistory@gmail.com. Anybody that wants to write in and respond. Again, I'm always open to correction. I'm not a professional at any of this. I'm just talking about what my personal experiences are. You'll be talking about what your personal
Mhm.
experiences are, and then we'll just be
Mhm.
talking about our collective Mormon history, our
Mhm.
ancestors. But I don't have any illusions that I'm going to get everything right. And so I'm always open to
Mhm.
because I
Mhm.
do want to be accurate as much as possible. And really, honestly, I just want to start a conversation. Whomever might benefit from this conversation about
Mhm.
the generational trauma of the Mormon people. And of
Yeah.
course, people are not Mormon and they're interested in listening. Free. That's
Mhm.
not a problem at all. But that's the purpose of what we're doing. And just in conclusion, we're grateful for people that have listened thus far, and we're
Mhm.
excited for them to jump on this journey with us.
Absolutely.